Today I want to talk about something a little bit different than what I normally cover on this channel. I normally talk about spirits, but today I want to dive into another realm, specifically one that's adjacent, and that's going to be about the company that makes this. Now, the world of beer is really interesting, especially as we look at the boom that's happened in the early 2000s. And Goose Island is the perfect example of that. The great way we can talk about that is with the pioneer behind many of the great things, such as the Bourbon County brand stouts, the barrel-aged stouts, with Greg Hall. Greg Hall would spend his weekends bonding with his father. His father, John Hall, would travel to various stores to find beer he never had before. As a high school student, Greg was amazed at the selection available. Greg would sneak beers from his father's fridge, but was very quickly becoming one of the world's youngest beer connoisseurs, even though he wasn't able to legally drink. Greg left his family to pursue writing in college and headed to the University of Iowa. It was far enough away that he could be his own independent person, and it was his father's alma mater. He never took college too seriously, often trying to have experiences that he could turn into future novels. In his last year of college, he decided to spend the summer helping his father with his new venture, a brew pub in their hometown. He began working as the assistant brewer. The master brewer, Viktor Ekimovich III, a former engineering student turned homebrewer that joined Millstream Brewing in Iowa, they started off with kind of a few basic beers: Golden Goose Pilsner, Lincoln Park Lager, Hunkel's Ale, and Old Clybourne Porter. The pub opened up on Friday, May 13th, 1988. Greg was excited to show off the beers he helped make. Victor really focused on mentoring Greg. Greg's responsibility was to learn from Victor, clean the brewery, dump fresh bags of grain, and shovel out spent grain. Greg began to read all about beer in his free time and even attended events about learning more about brewing and beer itself. In 1990, Greg decided he wanted to be in charge and entered an 8-week brewing course at the Cider Institute of Technology. When Greg came back, he was given the promotion to restaurant manager from his father. He learned how the restaurant worked, how to understand his guests, and how to help his guests understand his beer. He worked tirelessly at the time, often working from 7 a.m. through 3 a.m. the next day. That same year, the whole family took a trip to Europe, mainly just for the beer. The whole family planned to only visit England and Belgium, but Greg wanted more. He stayed after everyone left and spent time at the different breweries in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Prague. He spent his time memorizing everything about beer and wanted to be the master brewer for Goose Island. But Greg was putting out his resume to other breweries, knowing that his father wouldn't file Victor for his own sake. But Victor was getting tired of the arduous label and quit in the summer of 1991.
Behold, Brewmasters.
Greg wanted Goose Island to have more options. They had 24 taps, but only 6 beers at the time. Greg doubled it and created an ambitious menu featuring Dunkenweizen, Cherrywood Porter, Tahiti, Finnish style, a modern Hefeweizen, and an English style mild ale. The English style mild ale, named PMD, was light at 3%, but had a misleading brown color. Greg used it with guests who wanted the lightest beer. This was it, lighter than Miller Lite. He also had fewer calories of what they made, so he'd use it to basically prank people. By now they had 20 rotating beers a year, now including a holiday spiced ale and an Indian Pale Ale, IPA. He was leading the charge at the brewery, and subsequently his father made him the public face of the company. He led tours, took media inquiries, and showed the operation that was all his family. Greg also was constantly using the space for experiments, and none paid off better than an experiment with a stout. Used nearly double the malted barley of other imperial stouts in the market, then aged the beer in used barrels from Jim Beam after a successful meeting with the master distiller Bourgogne. Spent 100 days in the barrel and then was released as Bourbon County Stout in the fall of 1995. It was the start of a revolution within craft brewing. In November of the same year, they opened up a new production brewery with the plan to make a lot more beer, enough to supply other bars in the Chicago area. They wanted to focus on fully flavored malt-driven beer, Hunkel's Ale. It was different from any macro brewery, but still approachable. Greg chose Matt Donaldson to lead the production brewery and focus on consistency, while Greg could mess around at the brew pub. The collaboration even resulted in the Goose Island IPA, which won 6 medals at the Great American Beer Festival between 2000 and 2012. After 1 year, they produced 15,000 barrels, making them the fastest startup in craft brewing history. Within 4 years, they reached fully 3,000 barrels, while stuck under 50,000 barrels for another 7 years. It was clear the distributor, who focused on wine and liquor, was the problem. They expanded to 13 states, by 2002 to assist with growing, but they felt like they could sell all of that locally with the right partner. They found that other distributors, mainly Anheuser-Busch and mill distributors of the area, were interested in taking on Goose Island as a brand, but the existing distributor, Union Beverage, had the right to deny it. Through negotiations, they agreed to stay with Union Beverage with a new company, US Beverage, as the master distributor and more funding to help them grow in the market. But it was clear that the spirit-first approach, where shelf life was not concerned, that both Union and US Beverage had, was not going to work. They allowed old beer to degrade on the shelves, and their growth disappeared with a decline of production from 2002 to 2003. Luckily, they were able to free themselves through an opt-out clause in their contract. It took some lawsuits, Goose Island was freed, but they were struggling with bankruptcy on the table. Greg had an idea to use the limits as a marketing opportunity. They used 4 experimental brews that will populate the brewpub to be produced at the Fulton Street production facility: Imperial IPA, Demolition 1800 Ale, Pierre Jacques Belgian Dubbel, and Bourbon County Stout, and to only brew 100 barrels of each. They were popular and had to up the quantities, nearly 1,200 barrels in 2006. They dubbed this their Resolve series. Greg had been toying with a new yeast, commonly known as Brett, which was largely ignored by the breweries with the exception of the Belgians. This wild style of yeast is on the unpredictable side compared to the yeast used by common lagers whose origins appear naturally on fruit skins. It produces distinctive flavors with an emphasis on funk, spices, fruit, and some tartness. Some other less appealing terms, such as horse blanket, sweaty barnyard, wet leather, and adhesive bandage, have also been used to describe his products. Greg and his team would use Brett to make the Matilda Belgian French-style ale. But Greg's interest in Brett is in the dimensions it can provide to a beer, specifically by adding more weight to it that would allow it to stand up next to a meal. One of Greg's obsessions with beer started to appear, which is something that had been done with wine for ages: food pairings. He would dine with friends and family and order food that paired perfectly with the beers he's made. But Greg wasn't always the one deciding what new beers needed to be made. Although he had a great deal of say in the matter, the business was growing. With a new marketing firm helping them out, they needed to make a more mainstream beer for the urban world. The sales team decided it should be a wheat. They wanted to make it the defining style of beer in Chicago. Greg was rather disinterested in the idea, so, like he did with many other projects, allowed a member of his team to lead the charge. The beer that they came up with is the 312 Wheat Ale, named after the phone area code for Chicago. It has a 4.2% ABV, so it could satisfy the desire for a light beer. They used a bright, bold yellow color scheme and a fun tap handle that represented a retro telephone. It started off for 6 months as draft only to build up hype, reaching 100 bottles within weeks, and then sold 12 packs at supermarkets afterwards. It was successful, and the sets could be seen from the penthouses of those working at Anheuser-Busch. This Chicago brewery was innovative, loved by its region, which Anheuser-Busch typically did not do well in, and was looking to expand its distribution. AB needed craft beer for success in this changing market. Bud Light and Budweiser were not growing year after year like it used to. The average beer drinker was getting both wiser and more picky. Greg's father John was a businessman before anything else. He saw the opportunity that the help from AB could bring. In 2006, they saw negotiations that weren't going that well. So they decided to prize August 4th, the president of Anheuser-Busch, which was visiting a Chicago steakhouse. After friendly banter and sending round and round of their own bills to the Busch bigwigs, found a conversation between John and August. Within 6 days, a deal was made. $3.5 million for the 42% stake. The stake wasn't going to be directly owned by Anheuser-Busch, but rather a subsidiary of theirs, Widmer Brothers. Widmer Brothers was originally a craft brewery based out of Portland, Oregon, known for its Hefeweizen-style beer that used Cascade hops. AB had a fully blended Widmer and knew this would be better public optics to appear as a merging between two craft brewers. Widmer Brothers later merged with Red Hook Ale Brewery in November 2007 to form a new company called the Craft Brew Alliance. The best part of this agreement was that Goose Island was now part of the Anheuser-Busch distribution network. Innovation thrived in this time too. Juliet, a wild ale made with blackberries and aged in wine barrels, began to sell out in 10 days. Greg wanted the label to resemble wine bottles rather than traditional beer bottles. He wanted these beers to feel luxurious and elegant. They also expanded the Bourbon County Stout, now with vanilla, coffee, and rare. They decided to release it on Black Friday at the liquor store across from the brew pub. They sold out within 3.5 hours, and the $45 rare bottle was already being resold for $150 per bottle. They were growing and growing fast. They couldn't keep up. They were facing problems with expansion and meeting the demand for it. They had to stop brewing some brewpub favorites in order to focus on 312. Anheuser-Busch could see they needed some help, and in October 2010, John received a phone call. Yes, John was interested in selling all of it. Greg was not happy with this. It was their family's brewery, and he shaped the brews that led Goose Island to success. But he understood his father and why he wanted to sell. Greg helped his father with negotiations. Greg told the story of the brewery because Greg was the story of the brewery. But John had a few demands. It had to stay an autonomous Chicago-based company. It should stay as Goose Island and not as Anheuser-Busch. Brewing would stay supervised by their own brewmaster.
Brewmasters.
They agreed to the demands and soon they reached the number of $16.3 million for the remaining 58% stake. All employees found out on a company-wide meeting on March 28, 2011 before it was announced publicly. The biggest bombshell though is that Greg was leaving. 1 more month was all that Greg had as Goose Island's brewmaster.
Brewmasters.
The reaction of fans was mostly negative. They felt betrayed by an innovative brand that was selling it to a large company that had been trying to destroy and mock craft brewing. But the public perception was about to get worse due to the results of their own brewer. 3 weeks after the sale, Greg and a number of other Goose Island employees went to a new craft beer bar, Bengals and Lace, to celebrate a birthday. Greg drank too much. At the end of the night, Greg stumbled to the bar and leaned up against it. The bartender joked with him. It looks like you're taking a piss. And in reality, he was. He placed 2 pints of golden liquid on the bar top, told everyone to not drink it. And as he sauntered out of the bar, the bartender felt the glasses. They were warm. The bartender yelled at Greg, "Hey, what's this?" "Beer," Greg responded drunkenly. "Then let's have a toast then," the bartender said. Greg declined. He stumbled, grabbed the glasses, and moved them to a ledge near the door. Greg continued to stumble out the door into the passenger seat of the car. The bartender went to throw out the glasses and spied Greg. He walked up and tapped on the glass. He introduced himself as the bartender who had to clean up Greg Hall's piss off the bar. The final words the bartender said, "Enjoy your newfound fortune and have a great night." The next morning, Greg sent a Facebook message to the bartender as an apology. He also wrote publicly on his Facebook, "My bad." Greg on the way out the door, but more importantly, Chicago's craft beer scene. Greg was out. Goose Island could no longer be Greg, and Greg wouldn't be Goose Island. He flew from Chicago to escape the world of beer and spent the summer and fall in England and France to stage at cideries and learn a new world to him. Primarily spent the summer with Domaine Dupont in Calvados department of Normandy, France, and Olivers in Herefordshire in the West Midlands of England. He needed to distance himself from beer, and it allowed him to challenge himself in a new realm. However, he would still receive a 6-figure salary as a consultant to Anheuser-Busch and Goose Island. He moved out of Chicago and into a quieter, more rural town of Fenville, Michigan, 2 hours north of the original brew pub. Greg bought this farm where he built the cidery from scratch based on everything he learned as brewmaster of Goose Island and from his own experiences overseas. Greg had a passion for fermented drinks beyond wine. He saw a future where both beer and cider could be as well regarded and complex as wine has been. Vulture ciders never added any additional sugar like other ciders on the market, with an emphasis on the natural. Meanwhile, Goose Island seemed to be going in the opposite direction. 312 Wheat Ale was moving production from Chicago to one of Anheuser-Busch's breweries in Baldwinsville, New York. The beer, literally named after Chicago, would no longer be from the area. Hunkel's Ale and Goose Island IPA will move to Baldwinsville shortly after. But things were not good internally. The main contact between John Hall and Anheuser-Busch was gone, just out of nowhere. All the agreements that were made to John seemed to be gone too. He was no longer the decision maker. Anheuser-Busch was in control. Anheuser-Busch filed the dedicated Goose Island salespeople. Anheuser-Busch decided to brew more Goose Island beers in Montreal and Fort Collins, Colorado. John disagreed with all of this. The biggest point of contention was expansion plans. Slow and steady wins the race is what John and the whole Goose Island team believed. The distributors needed education. Spain forced on draft and then bottles. But Anheuser-Busch was ready to push it national. 4 beers nationwide in a matter of months. Very aggressive. A few months later, they would appear in supermarkets in 12-packs. And now, John was out. He planned to stay with the company for at least 3 years after the buyout, but he barely lasted a year. The hopes of Goose Island by Anheuser-Busch also barely lasted a year. Hunkel's Ale dropped by 18.6%. 312 was basically flat, and Goose Island IPA was not growing spectacularly, but it was growing. In a market where IPAs were the next big thing, it was underwhelming. They added a new pale ale under the 312 name, which disappeared after a year. All the new beers being experimented tasted like big beer masquerading as craft beer. New beers weren't coming from the Fulton Street Brew Pub, but from directives of the new CEO, Andy Golub, a big beer alum. A new warehouse was rented to expand the barrel aging programs, which showed that Goose Island was sticking to the roots. Public perception after 3 years was finally uplifting. A new marketing team was brought in with more advertising, public tours of the brewery, and nationwide tap takeover events with actual rules. But the beer was stagnant in the market. They reworked IPA, remarketed it, and they focused solely on the IPA for expansion. Greg Hall, meanwhile, released his first batch of Red Streak, his flagship cider. Initially, sales were due to his name being attached, but the product was subpar. Each batch proved to be very different and lacked quality control for off flavors. Greg wanted to grow despite the negative opinions about cider. He hired a top beverage director, grew distribution, but was running out of money. The USDA halted Vulture's produce buying ability in April 2015 after failing to pay an apple grower nearly $110,000. It's clear that Greg didn't know how to run a business after all. That's what his dad did with Goose Island. In September 2015, Anheuser-Busch acquired 51% of Vulture's cider, protected Anheuser-Busch in case sales took off, and also prevented Greg's company from folding. He had been on the payroll at AB after all. 2 years later, Anheuser-Busch owned all of Vulture's cider. 2023, Anheuser-Busch InBev began to struggle. After a sponsorship campaign with transgender woman Dylan Mulvaney for Bud Light that was meant to attract a younger audience. By that, they ended up angering their key demographics. The stock fell 20%, Bud Light sales fell between 11 and 26%, Anheuser-Busch's market share had fallen from 46.9% in 2011 to 48.6% in 2021. This clear shift in the audience showed that they couldn't be putting money into ventures that weren't worth it. Seltzers and candy cocktails were taken off.
Probably just a hard seltzer.
Nice. What kind?
Just a JCPenney.
But cider hadn't. Cutwater Spirits was bought in 2019 by Anheuser-Busch, and Neutral was launched in 2021 to counter High Noon. In August 2023, Anheuser-Busch decided to load off several brands of mainly craft. Shock Top, Blue Point Brewing, 10 Barrel Brewing, Red Hook, and Wilmore Brothers were sold to Tilray Brands, a cannabis company. In October 2023, they sold Vulture Cider back to Greg. What the future holds for Vulture Cider and Greg Hall is unsure. Right now, the focus is on a quarterly cider club that costs $90 and contains full ciders. They offer a lot of direct-to-consumer and ship to 41 different states. They also offer a bespoke experience at their tasting room and offer tools. Vulture Cider was never a brand built for expansion, unlike some of the groundwork done for Goose Island. It feels today that their distribution is mostly in Michigan and Illinois. Greg is now 58, and a slower, more local option might be better for him. Craft beer, and now craft cider, has been an opportunity to try new things that can't be done on a larger scale. Having different vintages year over year is something that works better smaller, and hopefully that's what Greg is planning, since he is, once again, has control and ownership of his company. So there was an issue I had when I was recording this video, and that's why you haven't seen me much on screen, it's my video cut out. I would love to hear what your guys' favorite Goose Island beers are. Do you like the Bourbon County brand stouts more than their IPAs or the 312 Wheat Ale? Or have you even been to the brew pub? Well, I appreciate you for watching, and if you like this type of beer video rather than just a focus on spirits, please let me know down below in the comments, or give this video a like. I am Zachary, thank you for watching Behind the Bottle, and cheers.